Okay, Alexander, let's do a video, more of a hopeful video, I think, without trying to put too much hope out there because we're living in very interesting times, as the Chinese proverb says. Interesting times. May the curse, the Chinese curse is what it is. May you live in interesting times. But there's a lot of bad stuff going on, but there is some hope around the world that things may be changing for the better. And I'm talking more about these the passports and the surveillance state, the deep state, the surveillance, the restrictions, clamping down on people's human rights. There is a lot of concern, and we've seen a lot of protests. We saw protests in Australia over the weekend. In London, there were protests as well during the week. Of course, the protests in France, which are now on their sixth week running, actually, and they're big. Even for the summer season of August, Alexander, a lot of people are turning up for August. So I suspect come September, the protests will get bigger, even though Macron is saying that he's not going to back down. That is Macron's stance. He's not backing down. So we'll see where that leads. But anyway, I saw a tweet, and one of the people on Twitter sent a tweet which said, "I'm losing hope," pretty much. I put it on the locals, by the way, so everyone can go on locals. They'll see the post that I put on locals, the Duran.locals.com. And the first tweet said, "No matter how strong I feel and am, we are not winning this. We hope, we pray, it's not working." So someone doesn't have hope in what's going on in the world today. And then someone comes in and they said, "You're looking in the wrong places. Romania is closing down their jab centers. Russia is changing its laws because of non-compliance. Denmark is scrapping all the nonsense by October. Australia is fighting back on the 31st, where they have another strike, a trucker strike. France is fighting back for a while now. Keep the faith." And it is true. There are some places. One of our viewers also told me in Switzerland, they're also starting to fight back. Many of the cantors, the police are starting to say, "You know what? We're not going to go along with the surveillance and the passports." Not in all the places, but you are seeing some pushback. I'm seeing it here in Greece as well. Pushback, not on a protest level, but more on a very local level, like a neighborhood level. People are just like, scanning stuff and stopping people from having a coffee is just kind of ridiculous, especially in our little neighborhood on a very local level. So, Alexander, without trying to give too much hope, because we all need to be careful and we all need to be aware. When you look at our logo, be aware. Look east, look west, look right, look left, be aware. But there's some hope. And you've also been saying in many videos that you believe at the end of the day, we will win, human rights will win, and there is hope out there.
Well,
what do you think?
The fundamental point always to understand is that you can do all kinds of things. You can come up with all kinds of ideas. You can come up with ideas for sweeping ideas like passports and all kinds of controls. But if a critical mass opposes you, then you will fail. And that's exactly what's happening. I mean, just before we did this program, you were telling me about a program about the fact that the Russian parliament has apparently taken a decision against passports. Well, of course, the Russian parliament is up for re-election in September. And the ruling party there is finding it extremely difficult to get people to come out and vote for it. And I'm sure that one of the reasons is precisely because they're coming up with ideas like this. So that's why they've turned round and they've scrapped it. And I think that that's going to happen in more and more places around the world and across Europe. You can't hold people down and keep them in fear forever. Sooner or later, they rebel against you. They did so a few months ago in Madrid, if you remember, in Spain. They're doing it in all sorts of other places. And the more one sees also of the incoherence and actually weakness of governments, of the governments around the world that are trying to conduct these policies, the more clear it becomes to me that they can't be implemented. They will fail. a government like the government of China, with the enormous powers that it has, the kind of political system it runs, it's able to do many kind of things which Western governments at the moment, and not just Western governments, would aspire, would like to do, but they just don't have the kind of power and the degree of control that the government of China does, and their attempt to copy it is failing.
Okay, so let's start with three. Let's focus in on three places that we're seeing significant pushback, and you could give your thoughts. And since you mentioned China, let's focus on the Asian model, which we've called it the China model is actually what we've called it, which seems to be the model that places like Australia and New Zealand are implementing. We've had a lot of news coming out of Australia. Tucker Carlson has really picked it up as well as to what's going on in Australia. You have a trucker strike on the 31st, which they say is going to happen. The government's saying they're going to stop it. Anyway, you had protests in the weekend, which turned violent. A lot of police were there. The laws, the fines, it's really getting to the point of outrageous. I mean, the fines are just outrageous. There's stories of they were killing dogs because they were afraid of people coming out to pick up those dogs. Just a really bad look in general for Australia as a country, like a bad look on the world stage. And it kind of highlights that maybe the leaders are just taking it too far. And like you said, implementing this China model to handle things doesn't work in a place like Australia. It's giving the country a bad rap, a bad name. It's making the country look scary to a lot of outsiders. I mean, I look at Australia now from the outside, and I'm saying this place is scary if you want to go visit or live, because the leaders just seem like they've taken things. I mean, they're taking stuff too far, but they've gone completely over the edge.
I have to say, I'm very surprised. I personally am very surprised that things have been allowed to get as far in Australia as they have. I mean, the kind of Australians I have known have never been the sort of people who I thought it would be easy to push around and impose lockdowns on. So I personally was surprised that this policy was persisted in as long as it was, and that it met as little resistance as it did. But of course now things are beginning to come together. You talk about a truckers' strike. You say that the government wants to say that's not going to happen. They're going to declare it illegal and all that. But sooner or later, if things continue as they are, people will strike. I mean, they will be prepared to come out on strike, no matter what the government says and no matter what the government does. And that is a very, very dangerous moment, because if people are pushed to that point and start to do that and start to go against what the government says is the law, even whether it is or not is another question. We discussed that with that interview we did with Robert Barnes. I'm not going to revisit that in this program. But once that happens, once people are prepared to take that step, and a critical mass of them do that, then a government is in very serious trouble indeed. Not just the government, by the way, but an entire political system. Because, of course, the whole nature of political systems is that they are based on law. And the idea is that, people obey the law, or a critical mass of people obey the law. If a critical mass of people are refusing to obey a law, then, as I said, the political system is in very, very deep crisis. I'm surprised it's taken as long as it has in Australia to get to this point, but we are obviously approaching that critical point now.
Okay, let's go to Russia now. Elections in September. The party that backs Putin, United Russia, is not doing well at all in the polling numbers. There is always the pressure that the West and the NGOs and the people behind Navalny are going to cause trouble in the country, and they're going to try to destabilize the Putin government. So you have the Duma coming out, and they're basically going against the orders of the Russian Ministry of Education, the Education Ministry, and saying, look, no mandatory jabs for government, teachers, and police and students, etc. People have the right pretty much to choose. It's voluntary. So the Duma stepped in. Obviously, this is a political decision. I don't think this has much to do with health. This has a lot to do with politics. But you're seeing this out of Russia. And then, of course, everyone always talks about Putin. I'd like you to talk maybe a couple minutes about that, because Putin is thought to be, many people think of him to be some sort of anti-globalist to a certain degree. I mean, he's part of the club. There's no doubt about it. You can't become president of Russia without being part of the club. But, he's always been someone that many people perceive to go against the globalist agenda and kind of, march to his own drum, to the drum of his country, for the good of his country. So what do you make of Putin's involvement in all of this that's going on in Russia? They did try to implement QR codes and stuff like that for a week in Moscow, and it didn't work. But there were no violent protests or uprisings. Just people were just like, no, don't do it, and they stopped it. So what do you make of what's happening in Russia?
I think Putin is basically an anti-globalist. I mean, he's somebody who is close to the, some leaders, but I think he does conceive of himself and identify himself and personally thinks of himself as somebody who is opposed to the process of globalization. Remember, he made that speech, I think, about a year ago, which we discussed, in which he came out very strongly and criticized globalization in very straightforward and vigorous terms. But you can be anti-globalist and you can still be somebody who wants to impose controls and who has, if you like, a desire to maintain your grip on your own country and to do those things. And of course, he is very close to China politically, to the Chinese. So it's perhaps not entirely surprising. And perhaps he was, encouraged by the Chinese to try to reproduce some of their methods in Russia itself. Well, as we have seen, it hasn't worked. Russia, of course, has come out from a very authoritarian history. I mean, there is huge resistance in the population to having those kind of controls reimposed on them again. And there is a reaction. And of course, there are elections coming up in a few weeks. But quite apart from anything else, as you absolutely rightly say, the Russian government needs to maintain control anyway because of the pressures that Russia is under. So you see that the government there is being extremely flexible. So they experiment with QR codes, then they give up on them. They talk about passports. They did talk about passports. Now they're not going to do them. They have consistently said that they're not going to have, they're not going to make the jab compulsory, even though they at times floated the possibility that they might do. So in a way, they're much more flexible about this than some Western governments are, because the nature of the political system and the political realities in Russia and the fact that the country is in a state of confrontation with the West shows that they have to respond to the feelings of their population because they have no real choice. And that's what you're seeing happening in Russia. By the way, I anticipate that sometime over the next couple of weeks, the situation politically for United Russia, or at least for the political system, will stabilise. And I suspect that one of the reasons why the ruling party's polling ratings have tumbled is precisely, obviously, because they've been taking the restrictions that they have, but because also, of course, there's been an upward blip in inflation in Russia, as there has been in many other countries, and that has obviously hit living standards, and people are taking that out on the ruling party. But I think that before September, the government will be able to pull it together, and if there is going to be a fall in the ruling party's support, I suspect that the kind of parties that will benefit will be the Communist Party, which is still there and still strong in Russia, and other parties like the Liberal Democratic Party, which is strongly patriotic and nationalistic and anti-Western, and it will not be Navalny and his crowd.
Okay, so let's go to what may be the most interesting of the bunch, and I think that's France, because we're talking about elections. Macron has elections in September, and he is definitely not doing well, that's for sure. neither is Le Pen. She's kind of been a bit of a disappointment, I think, as well, because she hasn't held strong to her past positions. But France, you have 6 weeks in a row of protests, large protests. But Macron is coming out with statements. He is not backing down. So this kind of reminds me of the yellow vests to a certain extent. And I guess we can do an audit of the yellow vests and see exactly who won and who lost in what was going on there. You had 40 some odd weeks of straight protests. And eventually you did reach some sort of compromise. So is this a similar situation, or is this different? Because one would think that, with a year left until the elections, that Macron would be treading very carefully on how he deals with the French population with regards to restrictions and coof jabs and passports and stuff like that. But so far, Macron seems to be painting the picture that his government is not going to back down, and they're going to continue to move forward with their plans for passports and surveillance and stuff like that. What do you make of France?
Well, isn't it interesting? Because autocratic Russia, as it is called, shows great flexibility in dealing with this problem, and the government there is flexible and responsive to the mood of the population. Democratic France, you see the president becoming increasingly authoritarian in his responses and digging in and taking an ever more hardline position, almost, you could say, inviting, provoking protests from his own people, and seeming almost to want it that way, which is an extraordinary state of affairs. I think France is at an absolute crossroads. And let me first of all talk about Le Pen. Now, she has made many mistakes. She has watered down her platform, and as a result, she's lost definition. And we see a lot of support for her, which was there, is starting to float away, is starting to move away. I think she has now been given a second chance, because the crisis in Afghanistan and the current protests and Macron's position gives her a good opportunity, if she's got the intelligence to seize it, to harden up her image again in a way that I think would both appeal to a lot of people in France and might actually win over also some of the people who previously backed Macron, because they're now seeing how weak and unstable and fragile the position is becoming, and might be attracted to a leader who looks like they're in a position to give a strong lead. But it will depend on Le Pen. And if she doesn't take it, if she doesn't act in that kind of way, and the situation in France continues to drift, with the president taking an ever more hardline position on practically every subject, the population becoming increasingly unhappy and restive and discontented and disaffected and in an ever more rebellious mood, and no political leader in a position to mobilize that disaffection and to provide a convincing alternative, then the risk we will have is that either Macron himself or a Macron clone will be re-elected president in March on a very low turnout. The political system in France will become increasingly unstable, and we could very easily see a major crisis work itself out in France. I think in France, the political situation is far more fragile than it is in some other countries in Europe, especially in Italy. Italy is always the country that people look to and think it's unstable. I think France, precisely because it has more centralized institutions, is actually ultimately more brittle. And I think you could very easily see next year a major crash in France. So I think this is a moment when when Le Pen needs to do what de Gaulle did in the 1950s. In 1958, there was a major political crisis in France, and de Gaulle came forward and he said, I'm the person who will sort this out. I'm ready to form a government. The President of the Republic has asked me to form a government. I'm in a position to sort out the crisis. And he became that way the magnet which brought France together. Le Pen could potentially fulfill a same role. But the question is, does she have the strength of personality and the political courage to do it? She's been given a second chance. Now we will see whether she will seize it.
Is this Macron saying that he's basically conceded to the fact that he's not going to win in September? So, why should I relent on all of these restrictions and mandates? I'm not going to win. I have no chances. Is he kind of saying that in a way? Because Le Pen may not come through, and if Le Pen doesn't come through, I don't think she will. I've kind of lost my confidence in her. You have other people like I believe Philippot is his name, who was in Le Pen's party, who is now rising to. I mean, he's kind of stealing Le Pen's thunder when it comes to these issues, and he's at the forefront. He's even at the protests, and he's gaining some strength, but he's far away from I think challenging. But if Macron is saying I don't care anymore, I'm out anyway, and Le Pen is not rising to the occasion, what happens with France then? I mean,
well, what does indeed happen with France? Let's talk about Macron. I'm quite convinced, I'm absolutely sure, I follow Macron very closely, that he is far from given up. I think, on the contrary, and we've talked about this before, I think Macron believes, and is vain enough to believe, that if he just displays strength of will and purpose and power, then that will somehow work towards his advantage, and people will be drawn to him again, because the French supposedly always want an emperor figure to preside over them. I think that's what Macron thinks. I think he's utterly deluded about this. But then Macron, to say it straightforwardly, is deluded about many things. So I think that is what he sees. I think he sees Le Pen failing. I think he's obviously aware that his own popularity and his polling numbers are down. But I think he imagines that if he holds firm, there'll be a surge towards him in March, and that he will somehow come through. I think he's wrong on many fronts, and I would say that if he is right and he does manage to remain president after March, well, a crisis in France is probably only months away. That is what I think. And that will be a real crisis. I mean, it won't be like the sort of ersatz crises we've seen many times when there have been big strikes in France and people have come out on the streets, and it's actually behind the scenes, it's actually quite good-natured and humorous and all of those things. This time it will be for real, because people in France now are very angry, and they haven't been angry like this in a very long time.
What do you think people in the UK are going to do as we move into winter? I mean, we don't really hear that much about the UK and what the policy is. I don't think they've figured it out yet either, the Johnson government, exactly what policy they're going to take.
No.
What do you think is going to happen? Because there were protests, not huge, I believe, but during the week people were out on the streets.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in the situation in Britain at the moment is that essentially restrictions have been lifted. So that's taken a lot of the sting out of the protests. So I think that's partly why there aren't that many protests at the moment. And it also needs to be said, too, that to the extent that there is a political discussion or debate underway about anything in Britain, it's all taking place within the Conservative Party itself. And that also, to some extent, contains the protests, because you have a libertarian wing of the Conservative Party and you have a sort of more patrician controlling wing, if you like, but they're able to talk and argue, and that is able to give people a lot of the impression that things are more stable than perhaps they actually are. If the situation turns bad in the autumn, and there are indications the economy might turn bad, then of course we're in a completely different situation again. Britain is a very orderly place. It's a very orderly country. This is not a tradition in Britain for the people to rise up in the way that, say, it is in France. So I don't think that's a real risk. But, and of course, the government also has the enormous advantage that the Labour opposition is essentially invisible. But I think if there's a real turn of the situation in Britain, a deterioration of the situation in Britain, then what you will probably see is intensified factional infighting within the Conservative Party. So that's, I think, Britain. I think a more interesting country in a way is Germany, where I mean, it's quite clear to me that the political system is fragmenting. So you have the Die Linke on the left, who are excluded from power, the AfD on the right, who are excluded from power. Between them, they account for around a quarter to a third of the vote. All of the politics, therefore, takes place now in the centre, and no centrist party any longer has strong support amongst the German people, because Merkel's party, the CDU-CSU, the Union bloc, which has dominated German politics basically since the end of the Second World War, is in an advanced stage of disintegration. There's a lot of opposition and protest in Germany, especially a lot of it focused on in Berlin. And, you know, Germany has always appeared, I think, to be more stable than it actually is. Spend your time in Germany, you'll know what an edgy place Germany actually can be, and how you know, young people especially can be very, very you know, fired up and angry and protest and all that. So I think, you know, you just, you know, give it a little while and you could see all sorts of things happening in Germany perhaps next year.
All right, we'll end it there. A lot of stuff going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's
well,
very dynamic.
Well, as you said, the times are very interesting, good for us to discuss in a program. Perhaps not always good for people to live through. And we didn't even talk about the US, which is another story again. But anyway, as you're absolutely right, you say lots going on in the world, and certainly things to keep an eye on.
All right, theduran.locals.com. Everybody check us out down there, and the Duran shop, 10% off when you use the code Real News. Take care.